On a soft pearl gray Tuesday morning in the second week of April, 1983, on the flat black muck ground of the old drained Scioto Marsh, 4 miles west of the small town of McGuffey, Hardin County, Ohio, a 44-year-old Columbus vintage tractor flipper named Royce Tandy backed a gooseneck trailer up the lane of a 73-year-old corn and soybean farmer named Wilhelm Kettering, walked into a long, galvanized machine shed, pulled back a canvas tarp that had not been moved in 9 years, looked at what was under it for about 90 seconds, and offered $1,200 cash on the spot. He had the money in his jacket. He counted it out onto a workbench in hundreds. Royce Tandy was not a crook. That should be said plainly, because it matters to what happens next. He was a fast-talking, gold-chained, red satin show jacket man who worked the Midwest tractor show and farm auction circuit out of a shop on Alum Creek Drive in Columbus, and he made his living buying old iron out of Ohio and Indiana barns and putting it back together and selling it to collectors. And he was, in the honest judgment of everybody who dealt with him, an entirely fair dealer who paid what a thing was worth. $1,200 in April of 1983 was what that thing was worth. It was a 1919 tractor. It was chalked olive green under 64 years of shed dust. It had red steel spoke wheels, a 4-cylinder Waukesha kerosene engine, a plain steel pan seat, and no serial plate anywhere on the dash, the frame rail, or the transmission housing, because somebody had pried the serial plate off at some point before 1930 and never replaced it. A 1919 Huber tractor without a serial plate in unrestored condition in a machine shed on the Scioto Marsh was scrap iron with a story attached to it. Royce Tandy had bought 9 of them in the previous 4 years. He had told Wilhelm Kettering honestly and pleasantly that he was probably paying $200 too much, and that he was doing it because he liked the shed, and he liked the coffee, and he had driven 90 miles. Wilhelm Kettering, 73 years old, in wire rim bifocals and a faded green and white seed corn cap and a heavy tan Carhartt chore coat, stood there with his hands in his pockets and looked at the $1,200 on the workbench for a good long while. And then he said no. He did not say no because he knew what it was. He had no idea what it was. He said no for a reason so small and so stubborn that Royce Tandy, driving back to Columbus with an empty trailer that afternoon, could not stop turning it over in his head for the rest of the week. Wilhelm Kettering said, "My grandfather pushed that in here in the fall of 1919. He worked for Huber up at Marion. He never told anybody why, and he never told anybody why for 38 years, right up until he died in this house." He said, "I'd like to know why first." Otto Kettering had come to Hardin County, Ohio, from Baden in 1888 at the age of 19, with a machinist's ticket and no English. He had gone to work in Marion, 30 miles east, at the Huber Manufacturing Company, which by the turn of the century was one of the largest builders of steam traction engines, threshing machines, and road rollers in the United States, and which by 1912 was building gasoline tractors under the Huber name. Otto Kettering was, by 1919, a works foreman on the tractor floor at the Huber plant in Marion, Ohio. He was 50 years old. He had been with the company for 31 years. He had a wife, 4 children, 160 acres of black muck ground on the drained Scioto Marsh that he farmed on weekends and in the evenings, and, according to every man who worked under him, the most exact and least sentimental pair of hands in the building. In the summer of 1919, the Huber Manufacturing Company was building a tractor called the Light 4. The Light 4 was Huber's answer to the Fordson. It was a small, light 4-cylinder machine, and Huber sold a great many of them, and it kept the company alive through the brutal tractor price war of the early 1920s that killed dozens of American builders outright. But before Huber settled on the Light 4 that they actually built, they built something else first. They built 3 of them. The factory called them the trial machines. They were experimental, a heavier frame, a different final drive, a bigger Waukesha kerosene, engine, and a belt-pulley arrangement that was, by every account that survives, far better than anything Huber ever put on a production machine, and far too expensive to build at the price the Fordson was forcing on the market. The Huber board killed the trial machines in September of 1919. The engineering department wrote a scrapping order. It was signed on the 11th of September, 1919. It directed the works to break up all 3 trial machines, recover the useful castings, and return the balance to the foundry as scrap iron. The order went to the tractor floor foreman. The tractor floor foreman was Otto Kettering. Wilhelm Kettering was 73 years old, and he had been the unpaid volunteer archivist of the Hardin County Historical Society in Kenton, Ohio, since 1961, which meant that for 22 years he had spent every Thursday afternoon of his life in a basement room full of county deeds, church registers, threshing ring ledgers, and the personal papers of dead men. He was, in other words, exactly the wrong farmer to try to buy a mystery from. He started on the Wednesday. He started in the obvious place, which was the machine itself, and he found nothing, because there was nothing to find. No serial plate on the dash, none on the frame rail, none on the transmission housing. Somebody had pried it off. He had known that since he was a boy. He went to Kenton on the Thursday and pulled the Hardin County Historical Society's Huber file, which was thin. He went to the Marion County Historical Society on the Friday, which was 90 minutes on state routes in a 1976 Ford pickup, and pulled their Huber file, which was not thin at all. Huber was Marion's company, the way Fisher Body was Cleveland's, and he sat in that reading room from 10 in the morning until they put him out at 4:30. He found the Light 4. He found production figures, sales literature, a 1920 dealer bulletin, and 2 photographs of the Marion tractor floor. He did not find any trial machines. Nobody had written a history of 3 tractors that were never built. What he found on the following Tuesday, 9 days into it, back in his own kitchen on the muck ground at 11 o'clock at night, with his bifocals pushed up on his forehead, was a book. It was a 1919 Huber operator's manual. It had been on the shelf in the machine shed for as long as Wilhelm Kettering had been alive, along with a Farmel manual and a McCormick manual and 40 years of seed catalogs, and he had never once opened it, because he had never once needed to, because nobody had run that tractor since 1919. He opened it on the Tuesday night, because he had run out of other things to open. Folded between pages 62 and 63 of a 1919 Huber operator's manual was a single sheet of Huber Manufacturing Company letterhead, dated the 11th of September 1919, headed Engineering Disposition Order, listing 3 trial machines by trial number and directing the works foreman tractor floor to break them up and return them to the foundry. It was signed by the chief engineer, and underneath the signature in pencil, in a careful German hand, was a single line that Otto Kettering had written on the 11th of September, 1919, and that nobody had read in 64 years. It said, in German, Nein, nicht dieses, no, not this one. Wilhelm Kettering sat at his kitchen table until 2:15 in the morning. Then he put on his coat and his muck boots, and he took a flashlight, and he walked out to the machine shed in the dark. He did not look at the dash. He did not look at the frame rail. He did not look at the transmission housing. He had looked at all 3 of those 1,000 times, and they were bare. He went around to the left side of the machine, and he got down on the cold concrete floor of that shed on his 73-year-old knees, and he put the flashlight in his teeth, and he reached in behind the belt-pulley housing, into a blind pocket between the pulley shroud and the frame, a space a man could not see, into standing up, and could not reach into with a wrench, and would have absolutely no reason to put his hand into ever in the entire working life of the machine. And with his fingertips, he felt a small flat plate. He got a rag and a can of kerosene, and he cleaned it, lying on his side on the concrete, for the better part of 40 minutes. It was brass. It was about the size of a playing card. And it was stamped in the EAB small hard block letters of a 1919 factory die. X-2. Factory trial. Not for sale. Otto Kettering had been ordered to scrap 3 tractors. He had scrapped 2 of them, He had taken the serial plate off the third one and put it in his pocket, and he had riveted a brass factory trial plate into a blind pocket behind the belt-pulley housing where no scrap man, no dealer, no foundry hand, and no collector would ever look. And then he had driven it 30 miles home across Hardin County at night in the autumn of 1919 and pushed it into a shed and covered it and never said one word about it to anyone for 38 years. He had not stolen it. That is the thing Wilhelm Kettering understood, lying on that concrete floor at 3 in the morning, and it is the thing he made everybody else understand afterward. Otto Kettering had been a foreman for 31 years. He knew exactly what a disposition order was. He also knew, because he had built the thing with his own hands on his own floor, that the belt-pulley arrangement on the trial machines was the best piece of engineering that had ever come out of the Marion works, and that once the castings went back to the foundry, there would be no drawing, no pattern, and no proof that anybody had ever done it. So he kept one, whole, unrestored, unaltered, untouched. And then he waited for somebody in his family to be curious enough to go looking. It took 64 years and one flipper from Columbus offering $1,200. Wilhelm Kettering called the Huber Machinery Museum in Marion, Ohio, on the Wednesday morning. 3 men came out to the Scioto Marsh on the Friday. They were in that machine shed for 6 hours. They photographed the brass plate in situ before it was touched again. They photographed the disposition order, the penciled German line, the operator's manual, and the blind pocket behind the belt-pulley housing. They matched the trial number on the plate to the trial number on the 1919 disposition order, and then they went back to Marion and matched both of them to a single line in a Huber Manufacturing Company works ledger that had been sitting uncatalogued in a box in Marion, Ohio, since 1961. Trial machine X2. Built July 1919. Disposition. Scrapped. 11 September 1919. It was, they told him, the only surviving Huber experimental tractor of any kind, from any year, anywhere in the world. Every other one had gone back to the foundry, exactly as ordered, exactly as it should have. Wilhelm Kettering sold it to the Huber Machinery Museum in Marion, Ohio, in September of 1983 for $31,000. He did 2 other things. The first thing he did was write a condition into the sale. The machine was to be displayed unrestored, in exactly the condition it came out of the shed, with the chalked olive green paint and the rust-brown streaks and the 64 years of Scioto Marsh dust, and the brass plate was to be displayed in a mirror mount so that visitors could see it in the blind pocket where Otto Kettering had riveted it, rather than have it removed and put in a case. The museum agreed. It is displayed that way today. The second thing he did was mail Royce Tandy a check for $4,000. Royce Tandy had not asked for it. Royce Tandy had no claim to it of any kind, in law or in honor, and he said so, twice on the telephone, at some length. Wilhelm Kettering told him that if a flipper from Columbus had not driven 90 miles out onto the black muck ground in April to offer him $1,200 for his grandfather's junk, he would have gone to his grave with that tarp on that tractor, exactly like his father had, and exactly like his grandfather had meant somebody not to. Royce Tandy cashed the check. He also, in 1985, sold the shop on Alum Creek Drive. He spent the next 26 years working, first as a volunteer, then on staff, for the Huber Machinery Museum's Provenance and Verification Program, driving out to barns and machine sheds all over Ohio and Indiana and Michigan, looking at old iron that nobody thought was worth anything. He never found another trial machine. Nobody ever will. There were only 3, and Otto Kettering scrapped 2 of them himself. But between 1985 and 2011, Royce Tandy identified and authenticated 119 significant Ohio-built agricultural machines that were, at the time he found them, about 11 days from a scrapyard. He always started the same way. He told the story about the $1,200 on the workbench and the old man in the bifocals who said no, and then he asked whether he could have a look behind the belt pulley. Wilhelm Kettering died at his own kitchen table on the muck ground in November of 1996 at 86. He is buried in the McGuffey Village Cemetery on the flat black ground 4 miles from the shed. His stone is plain Ohio granite, and beneath his name and his dates there is one line, which he chose himself. It reads, "He looked behind the pulley." If this story stayed with you, there are more like it on this channel: Forgotten Machines, Quiet People, and the Work They Did. Subscribe, and we'll tell you the next one.